Today is Juneteenth, meant to commemorate the final end of slavery in the U.S. Under Joe Biden, it's even become a national holiday. But slavery never actually ended here, and Joe Biden has done more than his share to ensure that slavery is perpetuated. There's a lot of crowing about how this country is the land of the free and the home of the brave, but what I see is a country ranked by Freedom House in 62nd place for liberty, with the highest incarceration rate in history, and a population too afraid of the government they have armed to the teeth to do anything about it. If you'll again give me a few minutes of your time, I'll share a few thoughts on the supposed end of slavery and the rise of prison labor. First, let's look at what school children are taught across the country, that Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. This is, in a word, bullshit. The order was not enforceable until after the war and applied only to states in rebellion against the U.S. government, meaning that the 4 slave states still in the Union could keep their slaves, and slavery as a whole would not have been abolished even in the rebel states. The order was meant as an economic punishment for treason, not as a way to end slavery. Juneteenth remembers the application of the Emancipation Proclamation in Texas, the last holdout in this regard, in June of 1865, months after the war ended. But when our politicians tell us these were the last slaves to be freed, they're ignoring the 4 non-Confederate slave states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, whose slaves were not freed until the 13th Amendment was ratified in December 1865. But the 13th itself has one giant fucking loophole. It says that slavery is abolished except as punishment for a crime. This opened the door to immediate abuse, with the former Confederate states leading the way in a series of horrific laws meant to re-enslave the black population. Labor contract laws passed in many southern states requiring people to sign one or be imprisoned. Those contracts were little better than prison, forcing people into labor camps that were, basically like Soviet-style gulags. But the alternative was literal enslavement, with prison workers leased at a profit to former slave plantations and to dangerous mining work. Thousands perished in atrocious conditions in the mines, while overseers laughed and unreconstructed Confederate politicians ignored their Civil War loss to create a culture of racialized terror. For nearly a century after the war's end, black men could be picked up for jaywalking and sent to work in cotton fields without pay. Tell me that is freedom, America. Now, Native American residential schools also used forced labor for everything from farming to construction work, and we tolerated this until the 1970s. Like with the enslavement of criminals and exploitation of black men, this kind of abuse passed unnoticed by most Americans. Heck, we didn't even grant indigenous people U.S. citizenship until 1924. And it took more than 50 years after that for the many reports of abuse and enslavement in residential schools run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to result in real reform, and eventually in closing down most of the system. Americans love to deny what is right under their noses. Speaking of which, another place where slavery persists is in U.S. colonies overseas, like in the Northern Marianas Islands, where foreign workers are enticed to move to the islands. Their passports are then seized, and they're locked into sweatshop work, kind of like in the 19th century. And they crank out clothing there that has a nice, happy Made in USA label on it, despite being produced in a colony by indentured workers with no labor protections or civil liberties. And again, we turn our heads and ignore it all. The most significant source of modern slavery is in the prison industrial complex. Politicians are paid by lobbyists for the carceral industry to pass laws with steep punishments for minor or victimless crimes like smoking dope. Judges are then bought off by campaign contributions to pass harsh sentences for minor first-time offenses. The prisoners are then compelled to work by federal mandate and paid little to nothing for doing so. Some of this work is extremely hazardous, like fighting literal fucking wildfires in California forests for a few cents an hour. The number of exposés of prison labor and conditions and all this hasn't led to strong calls for its abolition. In fact, politicians running on promises to lock up more people and restore order continue to win elections across the country. The prison industrial complex holds about 1% of the U.S. population in its grasp already, and about 5% of Americans will serve time in prison within their lifetimes. A smaller share of the total population, to be sure, than were slaves before 1860, but still a massive indictment of American freedom, especially given the well-documented abuses of the justice system and the number of blatantly racist laws still on the books. Among these are our drug laws, which treat powdered cocaine as a lesser offense than crack cocaine solely because the former is consumed overwhelmingly by better-off white people, while the latter is prevalent in poor and African-American neighborhoods because it's cheaper. These laws also treat cannabis, which is non-addictive and cannot be overdosed, as a greater offense than cocaine. That's right, weed is called a Schedule I narcotic, and this despite it not being a narcotic at all, because the U.S. government insists it has no medical value and is harmful, while most opiates and powdered cocaine, which are all highly addictive and lethal, are Schedule II and carry smaller penalties. This was deliberate, with the architects of the drug war in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s claiming that they could hurt the hippies, leftists, and African Americans by going after them this way. And do not for a minute forget that Joe Biden has repeatedly bragged about his tough-on-crime policies and his crime bills in the 1980s and 1990s. Biden, in fact, authored many of the major crime bills of those decades, and for fuck's sake, his 1991 bill was co-authored with segregationist Strom Thurmond, for whom Biden has shared many a kind word all the way to the present. He authored and sponsored legislation that made prison labor a requirement for all who are physically capable of it, and established mandatory minimum sentences to remove judicial discretion and keep the prison population high. This means that anyone who goes to prison is now legally enslaved by the U.S. government, often for a substantial number of years, and leased out to corporations, just as in the days of Jim Crow. Prisoners receive anywhere from 12 cents to 40 cents an hour for their work, but are still liable for expenses while in prison, for things like medical co-pays, food, and clothing. And many prisoners leave the institution in debt to it due to these pay-to-stay laws. In addition to being exempted from minimum wage laws, prisoners lack other workplace protections, such as against overtime or for safer working conditions and so on. The system here in 2024 is much like it was over a century ago, and you can't tell me that arresting someone for a victimless crime, forcing them into labor for pennies, and then charging them more than they earn for the privilege of staying there isn't fucking slavery. To summarize, slavery was not ended by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, nor by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, and it has continued, often in highly racialized form, all the way to the present, with many major politicians still active and on the so-called left, from Chuck Schumer to Joe Biden, being architects of modern slavery. Now, granted, the Republicans are these days far worse on this issue, but both major parties in the U.S. are pro-slavery, and all the propaganda around the supposed end of slavery on 19 June 1865 should be shoved right up all these politicians' wrinkled arseholes. The U.S. is a police state with a huge slave population, and until enough people care about it and fight to change it, we will remain by far the least free country in the rich world.